In the summer of 1776, 56 men walked into a brick building in Philadelphia, knowing they might never walk out alive. They weren't soldiers, they weren't revolutionaries, they were lawyers, farmers, and merchants, and they were about to sign a document that would make them traitors to the most powerful empire on earth. This is the day America was born, and these men knew the price of freedom was death. Philadelphia in July 1776 was sweltering. No air conditioning, no electric fans, just brick buildings baking in the summer sun. But this wasn't just any city. With 40,000 people, it was the largest in the colonies, wealthier than Boston, more important than New York, a major port where ships from London and the Caribbean arrived daily. The streets were cobblestone, brick buildings lined every block. Church steeples rose above the roof lines, and in the center of it all stood a modest government building, the Pennsylvania State House. Today we call it Independence Hall, but in 1776 it was just another legislative building where colonial politicians met to argue about taxes and trade. Except in the summer of 1776, they weren't arguing about taxes anymore. They were deciding whether to commit treason. War had already started. Battles at Lexington, Concord, and Bunker Hill had killed hundreds. George Washington was in New York preparing to fight the British Army, but declaring independence, that was different. That wasn't defending your home. That was rebellion. That was treason. And the penalty for treason was death. For weeks, delegates had been arriving, riding for days over dirt roads, leaving their families, their businesses, their comfortable lives. Benjamin Franklin, at 70, was the oldest. He'd spent years in London trying to prevent this crisis. Now he was committed to independence, even if it cost him everything. John Adams from Massachusetts was the most passionate advocate, loud, argumentative, relentless. He'd been pushing for independence for months, wearing down the cautious delegates one by one. Thomas Jefferson was only 33, tall, red-haired, brilliant with words, but terrible at public speaking. He preferred to write rather than debate. John Hancock, the richest man in Massachusetts, presided over the Congress. His shipping fortune made him a target. The British would love to hang him as an example. These weren't radicals. These were successful men with everything to lose. They had wives and children. They owned property. They had reputations. And they knew exactly what they were risking. If the rebellion failed, the British would hunt them down. Their property would be seized, their families disgraced, and they would hang. Not a quick death, hung, drawn, and quartered. The traditional punishment for treason, brutal, public, designed to terrify anyone else who might rebel. Every man walking into that state house understood the stakes, and they walked in anyway. Inside the assembly room, the debate raged. Windows closed despite the heat. They couldn't risk British spies overhearing. 56 men crowded into a space built for Pennsylvania's legislature. The air was thick with sweat, tobacco smoke, and tension. Some argued for independence immediately. Others wanted to wait. A few still hoped for reconciliation with Britain. The moderates asked, "How can we fight the British Empire? They have the world's most powerful navy, professional soldiers, unlimited money. What do we have?" The radicals answered, "We have the right. Governments get their power from the people, not from kings. If a government becomes tyranny, the people have the right to change it." For days they debated, then weeks. The heat grew worse, tempers flared, compromises were made. On July 2nd, 1776, they voted. 12 colonies said yes to independence. New York abstained, waiting for permission from home. The vote was done. They were committed. No going back now. But they needed words, a formal declaration to send to the world explaining why they were breaking away from Britain. Thomas Jefferson had been writing it for weeks in his rented rooms, a document that would justify their rebellion, not just to Britain, not just to the world, but to themselves, to explain why this terrible risk, was necessary. On July 4th, they debated Jefferson's draft, word by word, line by line. They cut about a quarter of what he wrote. Jefferson sat silent, watching them tear apart his carefully crafted phrases. Benjamin Franklin leaned over and whispered a story to comfort him, about a hat maker whose friends edited his shop sign until nothing remained but his name. But what survived the editing was revolutionary. We hold these truths to be self-evident. that all men are created equal. No king had ever said that. No government had ever been founded on that principle. For the first time in human history, a nation was declaring that rights come from nature, not from royal blood. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. Power flows up from the people, not down from a king. That whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it. The people can overthrow tyranny. Revolutionary words, dangerous words, and then the final line. We mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. This wasn't just political theory. This was a blood oath. Most didn't sign until August 2nd, when a formal copy was ready. But John Hancock signed that day, in July, his signature so large, he reportedly said, "The king can read it without his spectacles." It wasn't bravado, it was defiance. Every signature was an act of courage, every name a target. Benjamin Franklin joked, "We must all hang together, or most assuredly, we shall all hang separately." But it wasn't really a joke. It was the truth. On July 8th, the Declaration was read publicly for the first time in the yard behind the State House. Thousands gathered. Soldiers, sailors, merchants, regular people who'd heard something big was happening. Colonel John Nixon stood on a platform and began reading, "When, in the course of human events," at first silence. People listened, trying to understand. Then, as the words sank in, "All men are created equal," a murmur spread through the crowd. When he finished, the crowd erupted, cheering, shouting, church bells ringing across the city. That night, they tore down the king's coat of arms from the State House and burned it in a bonfire. The symbol of royal power turned to ash. Similar scenes played out across America. In every colony, the Declaration was read, and everywhere Americans understood they weren't British anymore. They were something new, something that had never existed before. They were Americans, but independence came at a terrible price. 9 of the signers died during the war. 5 were captured and tortured by the British. 12 had their homes burned to the ground. 2 lost their sons in battle. Carter Braxton of Virginia, a wealthy planter, lost his ships to the British Navy and died bankrupt. Thomas Nelson Jr. told Washington's artillery to fire on his own house because the British were using it as headquarters. Richard Stockton of New Jersey was captured, beaten, and thrown in prison. He was so badly treated that his health never recovered. These weren't abstract sacrifices. These were real men who paid in blood, treasure, and heartbreak for the words they signed. They knew the risks, and they signed anyway. Because some ideas are worth dying for. The idea that you have rights no government can take away. The idea that you deserve to be free. The idea that all men are created equal. Today, over 1 million people visit Independence Hall every year. They stand in the assembly room where it happened. They see the chairs and the inkstand, but most don't think about the fear, the very real terror of knowing you could be hanged for what you just did. We know how the story ends. We know America won. We know it worked out. They didn't know any of that. All they knew was that freedom was worth the risk. 56 men, 1 building, 1 document, 1 idea that changed the world forever. Philadelphia, July 4th, 1776. When America was born. If you want to see more American history brought to life, let me know in the comments. There are so many more stories to tell. Thanks for watching.